Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 31 cheat sheet, and unfortunately with the FPL deadlines being so short, there's a very quick turnaround for this video, and I'm also recording these videos before the Sunday games have played. So this is a recording after the Man United versus Brentford game where, of course, Brentford completely dominated United but still ended up with only a draw, and that's sort of where I'm recording. I don't exactly know the full Liverpool impact, so maybe there could be some injuries. Do forgive me, of course, if there are any injuries. But I think we can still interpret the Liverpool team based on the information that we got from Jurgen Klopp in his pre-match press conference for Game Week 30. And hopefully, of course, all the Liverpool players will sort of be able to be fit going towards the Sheffield United fixture. But keep in mind, of course, this Liverpool turnaround, as well as for all the other teams here playing in Game Weeks 31 and 32, there is an insane turnaround, right? You're effectively playing something like Saturday, Thursday, and Sunday. And that's of course going to have a huge impact on rotation, and ultimately when we're going for players, you're going to see things like, for example, Garnacho's early substitution in game week 30 where you saw him get subbed pre-60, and that's going to have an impact on the short term. However, some squads are thinner than others. We also have players who have a sort of higher priority position within the team than others, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So starting with the midfield position here with the cheat sheet, we've got Sarabia up top with Palmer. For me, these are still the two most interesting assets, at these sort of price points, right? I've given Garnacho a drop, and part of that, unfortunately, is because, after, let's say, the Brentford game, you're sort of looking in the distance for a Chelsea away fixture, a Liverpool at home fixture, which is still pretty tough. And ultimately, I don't see Garnacho really being a transfer in until maybe game week 33 for most managers. So if I was to, let's say, show a preference right now for Sarabia or Garnacho, I would probably lean towards Sarabia right now. When you look at the fixtures in the distance for Wolves, he's probably going to play a lot of minutes. They just simply don't have enough players to play. And you can look at, for example, the fixtures: Burnley, West Ham, Nottingham Forest. Not to mention as well, if you keep Sarabia up until, let's say, game week 35, let's say you're someone who's actually, just simply looking for a transfer pick, and not even potentially looking for a future wild card, right? Sarabia is really nice because even on game week 35, you're looking at a Luton at home fixture. So that's really nice for Sarabia just in general with the kind of run that he has. And you've just overcome here the Aston Villa away fixture. So he becomes an even better asset than Garnacho, basically, in my estimations. As far as McAllister, he's been added as well. I'm assuming that McAllister will continue to basically start and play fixtures for Liverpool here and also play in a more advanced position, given that Endo, of course, is back in the team and he's also fit. And it really just depends on, of course, what his position is game to game. It might change. There might be games where McAllister will have to drop deeper. And over this run, of course, you'd prefer he plays, more advanced as possible. And we've seen some dividends of that, right? Some of the recent games where Liverpool have become a little bit more full strength in terms of the midfield, you can see now that McAllister's underlying stats are actually starting to rise. However, as we like to be on this channel as well, we do like to make sure that we're not overreacting. I think part of that as well is understanding that McAllister has different roles to play for this Liverpool team, and some of them might unfortunately lead to his role rather being a little bit less useful for FPL. So right now, I think he's an interesting pick. You ultimately have more fixtures than the rest of the field. You also have really good fixtures anyways in terms of Sheffield United home. This is a good sort of landing spot if you really sort of are looking for a differential, in my opinion, in this price bracket. And of course, this would be in addition to a Sarabia or in addition to a Palmer as well. In terms of the 6.0 position, the only change really is that there's an asterisk over Gordon, of course, because he has a blank fixture, unfortunately, due to a suspension in game week 30. This does sort of bode well for his suspension details, because I think if you look at the suspension rules, he was previously sort of on the edge of being close to those 10 yellow cards. The double yellow card and hence the red card actually sort of cancels that out, and basically he's set on 8 yellow cards. Therefore, he's not going to have any sort of suspension impacts in the short term. So whilst I think, of course, it's really sad that you missed out the Game Week 31 fixture, Gordon is effectively now back into a season keeper position within FPL. So that's really nice. And also we had an Almiron injury. So if, let's say, you're concerned about, let's say, Barnes being a threat to his position, I can't really see it. It's a good position to be in anyways, I think, as a Gordon owner. As far as Eze, one of the issues, of course, is that you're still looking at game week 32 and 33 as tough fixtures for this Crystal Palace team. So with Eze, it's the case that he probably actually has the better double than, a Sarabia, for example. But if you look at someone like Sarabia and compare and contrast, of course, it just comes down to whether you're actually able to, let's say, bench a player like Eze for game weeks 32 and 33. Alternatively, of course, You could instead maybe just wait for Eze as a Game Week 34 transfer, or even let's say if you go for Eze this week, if you have the potential to, let's say, play with 8 men and you have 2 players or a player who can actually cover and rotate for Game Weeks 32 and 33, you can still even consider him as a transfer now, because I still think he's a very, very good pick. But unfortunately, I think with the comparison of Sarabia being present, he still lacks a little bit there, and it just shows you how much value we have from some players within those elite positions. And Palmer, of course, is someone that basically fulfills the same condition. We just saw United play absolutely horribly, and Palmer is going to be amazing for Game Week 31 once again. So hard to actually sort of displace some of the status quo players like, your Odegaard, your Foden, your Salah, Saka, Sons of the world, the more expensive assets. But when you're looking for players at a cheaper price, and maybe this is actually to allow you to get a stronger front line, right? I think your Sarabia and Palmers are the best 2 options that you can actually get within the midfield position. And maybe it just calls for spending, once again, more money within the forward position instead, where, of course, I think we lack a little bit of value and guarantees in the bottom end of the forward position. I'll talk about that later on in the video. Outside of Muniz, of course, who just continues to be exceptional. And Mbeumo has also been added in the 6.x price tier. And part of that, of course, is Brentford just have really, really good games, to run off the end of the season. So for me, he's still a differential. And part of that is, of course, maybe that this Brentford team have been quite reserved in terms of managing his minutes. So you can see he's obviously coming off the bench. And of course, if the progression is slow, you probably still don't want Mbeumo up until Game Week 33, where you're looking at that Sheffield United at home fixture. And so that's the tough thing with Mbeumo, although I can already recognize that he's playing exceptionally well. Played really well as a substitute within the United game, and I think it's sooner than later, rather, where we get to see Mbeumo play, close to 65 minutes of football per game, and sort of that moving up to the 90s as soon as he's fully fit. So that's an interesting thing with Mbeumo. I think, as I said, just someone to keep in your mind. As far as Luis Diaz, he gets a rise partially just because of the Sheffield United fixture being so good. Another thing, of course, because Jota's coming back a little bit later, so his sort of ability to nail down that left-hand side, I think, has proven to be, unquestionable. So ultimately, if you have the capacity to, let's say, spread your funds within FPL, maybe you're even considering something as ambitious as maybe avoiding Salah, which I probably wouldn't recommend. Luis Diaz is there, ultimately. We are probably looking for 3x of Liverpool, even starting at the Sheffield United fixture. So if you're looking to, let's say, have room for someone like Luis Diaz, I think he's a very exceptional pick. Of course, we do mention time and time again that his underlying stats aren't anything exceptional, so they do compare very well to some of the other players within the field, and of course, he doesn't have set pieces, so the only thing here that's in his favor, of course, is just the quality of fixtures as well as the quantity of fixtures, so that's really nice over there. Maddison, unfortunately, has a fall this week, and part of that is because the last 2 games have not been looking good for Maddison. You're also in a fixture-dense period here, so my concern is that Maddison's probably not going to clock in consistent 85 to 90-minute games now in this period. Maybe he's being managed. Maybe he's not playing well enough for Angie's standards, but it's clear that Angie is happy to, for example, take Maddison off. Whereas with someone like Son, it's a little bit different, where I think we're always going to guarantee that at least 82, 85 minutes of football with Son. With Maddison is clearly not the case. It might be a question of fitness. It might be just due to the recency of this knock. But over the course of the season, we've also seen generally just better Son minutes than Maddison. And he also falls, unfortunately, passing by that Luton fixture where they just didn't play overall too well. Although he was at one point, pretty close to actually getting bonus when the game was 1-1 and all tied up. As far as the next tier, we've got Odegaard rising and Fernandes falling. Unfortunately, of course, Bruno just continues to play poorly, and part of that is simply because the United team itself is playing poorly, right? They lack control in several phases of play, and you could see the complete domination of that Brentford performance with United. They were effectively dominating United for most of the game, and you just have some sort of Hail Mary, basically quarterback-like balls from Fernandes that aren't really something that United can work off without, let's say, maybe Rashford being able to sort of play over the top and actually do something with those balls. So that is, unfortunately, the position that United are in. They do play, of course, better at home, and whenever you see performances like that, you can chalk it up to the away impact as well. We do talk about how bad away fixtures are. He is, of course, when you look at, for example, the cheat sheet as well within the midfield position, probably the biggest underperformer this season. So when you look at goals assists per 90, compare that to the expected goals involvement per 90, he, of course, is the most glaring underachiever. And part of that, I think, it just comes down to squad and just how this United season has played out. Although On the flip side, United have also been extremely fortunate to, I think, find themselves within the position that they are on the table. But ultimately, Bruno's short-term fixtures are not good enough. And similar to Garnacho, I think he does deserve to fall. And, you might want to revisit someone like Fernandes on a wildcard 35, but really there's no reason to even touch Bruno up until then. And that's pretty much that. Bowen, I have not touched him. He did, of course, play exceptionally well versus Newcastle. Part of that, I have to say, is I think Newcastle is an absolutely horrific defense, and unfortunately, they've continued to succumb injury upon injury. And you could see, for example, after losing Lascelles, how much easier the game was for this West Ham team. I don't think I'm going to overreact and suddenly put the West Ham assets back into your yellow and orange tiers or even the green tiers. And it's more so the case that players like Bowen or even Kudus, who I would consider as differentials right now, yes, of course, these are all very capable players, and ultimately, if they played for better teams, I'd probably be a bit more confident in them. If they had more fixtures, I'd be more confident in them. But ultimately, as I said, you probably don't really want to be spending that sort of money on those players at those price points. And instead, it does make sense to move into your players who just have more fixtures in the short term, as well as in the long term if you're thinking about just game week 37 fixtures. And let's say you're planning to free hit on 34. So that's something, of course, we need to be considering in general with our transfers and our sort of decision making going forwards. Whereas Odegaard, of course, good short-term fixtures, a double in 34. Nothing much more you can really ask for from a player who ultimately has been a very interesting pick. We probably have more guarantees in terms of, let's say, Odegaard's minutes than a Havertz, than a Martinelli. And so I think this is just a reflection of that. Whereas with Saka, with the exception of maybe the City fixture, which I don't know how that's going to go, was a very, very good pick. So in the forward position, moving on to that, we have not touched anything really within the budget position other than giving Mateta a rise. And I've given Mateta a rise because I think the underlying stats look good. And I think under Glasner, this Crystal Palace team have looked slightly better in the attacking phase. We're starting to see a slow tick in terms of their attacking numbers. But it's still probably not good enough for me to say that Mateta is an outrageously good asset. When you compare it to someone like Muniz, for example, his underlying stats are much clearer of Muniz than Mateta and Cunha. And so when you, let's say, look at Gaming 34 and cast your eyes over there, what's nice about Mateta, of course, is that Gaming 34 is probably better in terms of the fixture quality for Mateta than a Cunha. Whereas with Muniz, of course, it's just a case where you now have a pick who ultimately is absolutely ludicrous at his price point. He has really good underlying stats. He seems to be scoring absolutely everything and in every game possible. And I can't see how he's droppable whatsoever. Whereas with Mateta, there's of course that sort of question mark of could later down the line, maybe even around Gimme 34, could you see more of Edouard if he comes back? With Cunha, I think the question mark, of course, is he actually going to come back soon enough for you to get the full value of Cunha? Because as I mentioned, like Sarabia, the beauty of what Cunha should have been presented as a pick is that, let's say if he played limited minutes in Gaming 30 and was part of the squad in Gaming 30, we would have probably expected a start in Gaming 31. However, it seems like the timeline is still a little bit delayed compared to what we expect, and maybe that's because Wolves are sort of learning from their process of they're in a really good position in the table. They don't necessarily have too much to fight for. They're safe, and there's no need to sort of rush their players back and get them injured. Although Cunha has mentioned, and I think even Gary O'Neill mentioned that Cunha was absolutely bugging Gary O'Neill to play. So I think we'll see involvement in the Burnley fixture, and that probably means a start instead on the West Ham game. I'm a little bit concerned though, because a lot of people are going to be looking at Cunha as a transfer where you want to have Cunha play on Gaming 31, and that makes a world of difference in terms of how immediate that transfer needs to be. Whereas with Muniz, of course, he's someone that you can basically play week in, week out with no issues. Although he makes for potentially, of course, a worse team in terms of Gaming 34 as a ceiling. However, as I said, Cunha was previously quite nice and quite presentable in the sense that you were looking at someone who could play for these short-term fixtures, which were also really good. But then he also has ultimately that additional fixture in Gaming 34, and that could have been something that would have been really nice. As far as Jackson, no changes there. As far as the sort of top end of the forwards, we have given Watkins a drop. We did hear from Unai Emery that he suffered a knock. I think there is a little bit of, a change of the guard here with Watkins. I think we have to say that he's someone that absolutely is going to drop down the pecking order due to lack of fixtures, and just also when you compare, for example, to someone like Muniz, who has probably better fixtures to see out the season compared to a Watkins. I just think that Watkins is a little bit of too high a price to continue commanding a pretty expensive spot in your team. When you have players like Solanke and Darwin who double in Gaming 34, when you have Muniz who's been basically a budget Watkins at 4.6, when you have someone like Isak who's going to double in 37, there's no way where you're going to try and allow your FPL structure to be sort of controlled by Watkins. And I think therefore Watkins has to drop, even though I think he's not really, what we'd consider to be an orange tier player at any point in time of the season. But I think it's just more of a structural case where right now, if you're looking to plan for the short term, for the medium term, or even the long term, that Watkins doesn't really belong as part of your team. And you never know. This knock could be something that can have some short-term impacts, as well as, for example, his availability on that Brentford fixture. So that, in my opinion, just calls into question whether you want to have Watkins within your team at all. And getting Watkins out of your team, I think, will probably help your team structure as soon as possible. So that's why he drops. As far as the defense, we don't have too many changes, but it's more of a shifting gears in terms of aligning ourselves with the Game Week 34 fixtures. So that's why Brathwaite rises. We did hear in terms of Everton news that Mykolenko had an illness, but Tarkowski is probably the other Everton centre-back that you want to be considering. However, I think in FPL, from our experience, if two players are not too different, you're always going to pick the player who's cheaper. For me, Brathwaite presents that, and I think he still contrasts really nicely to Tarkowski, who, of course, we previously, heralded as the key set piece for this Everton team. But I just can't see why Brathwaite wouldn't be able to compete with that. He's also cheaper, so I think Brathwaite is just an amazing pick. And, recognition of that is being shown with the rise here. With Ait Nouri, yes, of course, he got subbed off quite early versus Aston Villa. Still post 60 minutes, but another thing that I have to mention is that he now has a very demanding role for his team. He also played a lot of minutes on an international break. So I think it just makes more sense that Wolves were probably keen to sort of see out that game without running Ait Nouri absolutely into the ground when there are much more winnable fixtures like Burnley, West Ham, and Nottingham Forest in the distance. So the way I see it is that Ait Nouri, for me, is still a very key player of this squad. And you could see that, for example, within the FA Cup games and just recently with all the attacking returns that he's built up. And part of that, of course, has been him moving slowly towards an out of position sort of territory where he, of course, you can see him occupying centre forward like positions. I'm not concerned about his lack of minutes within the Aston Villa game, and I'm not going to overreact to it this week with the cheat sheet. I still think he's a very good pick going forwards. And someone that I'd be very comfortable playing as well. With Munoz, he also gets a rise. Part of the concern with Munoz was that we were thinking maybe that he suffered an injury within the international break, and actually it turns out that that's not the case. With Chris Richards, of course, you just have a cheaper asset, someone who's probably not going to give you a lot of attacking returns, even though we have seen one already from Chris Richards this season. But yeah, I think it's just a case of with Crystal Palace, you're looking at these sort of defenders being useful for Game Week 31 and also Game Week 34. It depends on, of course, whether you're building a wild card or not. For example, I would not really recommend Munoz as a straight transfer on Game Week 31. However, if you're someone who's actually building a team, let's say in the short term or planning to dead end in the future, I think Munoz still holds a valuable place within the team. You're still looking at this Crystal Palace team once again being one of the elite defenses within the league, at least, being able to bracket them as a sort of top half defense. So that's really nice. And of course, he's sort of a double-edged sword, as we say. With Gusto, unfortunately, it seems like he suffered a hamstring injury, so I have to drop him. The hope, of course, is that he gets back for Game Week 32 versus Sheffield United, or Game Week 33 versus Everton at home. And ultimately, I think a lot of us managers were also hoping that he would play in Game Week 31 versus Man United. He played very well in the Burnley fixture. But of course, a lot of people are going to, in my opinion, overreact to the performance versus Burnley, which of course was shocking, right? Yes, of course, Burnley did score one screamer, but at the same time, conceding 2 goals to 10 men is something that is quite ludicrous. And I think that's a shocker. That's poor. But it doesn't mean that we should also overreact on Gusto unless the injury is a lot worse than imagined. So I think right now, provisionally, I'll drop Gusto. But I still think he's a brilliant pick. On the attacking phase, I think he's been amazing. And he definitely will find himself, in terms of the sort of entire cheat sheet here, as one of the leading defenders in terms of expected goal involvement. So you can already see here, Bradley with small sample size, of course, is quite clear of the pack. Porro has really good numbers. Trippier has good numbers. But first of all, 2 out of 3 of these players are unavailable. And at the same time, you've got someone like Trent who still is pretty much indisposed in terms of FPL. And so he's actually one of the most interesting attacking assets within the game from a defensive point of view. And we're starting to see, of course, a clear lack of clean sheets within the Premier League. So Gusto is still someone that I think I'd highly rate. And I think when you're listening to the news about Reece James and his availability for the rest of the season, it doesn't seem like this Chelsea team are going to rush him back to duty and to the field of play. So I really think that Gusto is still going to be a good long-term pick, and I'm not overall too concerned with him unless the injury turns out to be worse, as I said. With other changes here, we've got Udogie and Porro dropping. Part of that, of course, is that Luton fixture is gone. You're looking at these 2 players as very much so players that you can bank upon because of their attacking value. And unfortunately, of course, they just haven't really shown that sort of potential or, lived up to that in actuality. So they do have to fall. You also have to keep in mind that Spurs will have a Game Week 34 blank. However, they do have a lot of fixtures in general, which makes them still very good picks. For example, on a sort of Game Week 37, you probably still want to have your Spurs defenders in around the team. Definitely you want to have Son as well. But I mean, I think it's a fair question to ask. Definitely I wouldn't be considering doubling up on Spurs as a defense, but at the same time, does it make more sense to just simply spend money on Udogie, who is cheaper than Porro? I think it makes sense because, yes, of course, if let's say Madison plays less minutes of football, you're probably going to see more Porro set pieces, which actually makes him even better as a pick. But I think the concern is that ultimately he is very expensive. He's at 5.9 right now. That is a gulf of difference compared to Udogie, and maybe the gulf in attacking quality is not enough for me to spend that additional 0.9. We are in a field or in a time, I think, in FPL where a lot of people are looking for very, very specific and rigid team structures. And unfortunately, Porro might not be a part of a lot of FPL teams for that reason. So in my opinion, he very much deserves a fall as well, even though I've always preferred Porro to Udogie. As far as Dalot, I've given him a rise. And part of that is because this United team are still playing really well in terms of how many goals they're actually conceding compared to how much they should be conceding. Now, I think maybe it's a little bit unfair that I've actually risen Dalot, but I think that he just comfortably deserves to be amongst the pack here compared to players like Schär, Udogie, and Porro. Similar levels of defenses. Probably Newcastle is the worst. So I just think I was being a little bit unfair to Dalot, who, of course, has been very consistent for this United team. Probably one of their best players, although it doesn't say much considering the actual play this season has been horrible. But I'd be still quite confident in, for example, having Dalot within my team going forwards. And I think he's much more of a long-term pick than, let's say, some of the other players here, and just has a really good Game Week 34 fixture. So going forwards, of course, Dalot is a very nice pick, even from Game Week 33 onwards. Whereas, of course, when you look at, let's say, Udogie and Porro, there's that sort of yo-yo effect of good fixtures in the short term, then, of course, a blank, and then, of course, being good again because they just simply have more fixtures in the rest of the field. Whereas with Schär, the interesting thing is that Newcastle defense is so poor that I really think that he also has deserved the drop, because ultimately Schär is someone who is a little bit too expensive, considering that you're looking at the 15th or 16th placed defense in terms of expected goals conceded. Even when you look, let's say, restrict that amount of sample size to half the season or this half of the season, it's much worse, right? So Schär probably should be viewed as an orange asset, but I think part of the reason why I've still kept him here is because Newcastle still have, in theory, really good fixtures. So we'll see how they manage, of course, the sort of coming run of games. Schär, of course, has pretty good expected goal involvement, but I think right now you're still looking at, once again, prioritizing the short-term Game Week 34, and that's the same case here with the goalkeepers as well. What I've done is I've added Henderson to the cheat sheet. He's a new pick because, unfortunately, Johnson had succumbed to an injury whilst playing in international duty, or training rather, and of course he has to have season-ending surgery, so that just means that Henderson is nailed. And previously, of course, we weren't 100% certain about that, so that's why Johnston and Henderson were both not on the cheat sheet. Now that that's confirmed, and now that you potentially have a doubling goalkeeper, Henderson is a good sort of alternative option. As far as Neto and Leno, I think they both dropped. These are both players who just really have less fixtures either than the rest of the field in Leno, or with Neto's case, I think he's basically close to being dropped as soon as Game Week 31. So he might even deserve to not be on the cheat sheet. Maybe I'm overreacting, but I think we've already seen plenty of Neto mistakes this season, and I think he's very close to being dropped. So I'd expect to be actually taking him out of the cheat sheet before Game Week 34. But we'll see what happens, of course, and whether Iraola is as reactionary as myself. But that's going to be it for the cheat sheet this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you're wondering about the change in setup, unfortunately, I am recording away on vacation in Valencia here. So hope you guys enjoy Game Weeks 31 and 32 as they come by very quickly. And I'll see you guys very shortly for my team selection.